The South Carolina sun, a molten coin in the vast blue expanse, cast long shadows across the freshly paved parking lot of the Commonwealth Bank in Greenwood. Deshawn Greer, CEO of Bleetch Tech, adjusted his navy silk tie, the knot tight, the fabric cool against the skin. He smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from his impeccably tailored charcoal suit, a gesture almost automatic, a subtle ritual before entering any arena, be it a boardroom or a bank. The metallic click of his car door, echoing in the relative quiet of the late-morning suburban sprawl, seemed louder than it should be, an almost jarring sound against the gentle hum of the air conditioning unit perched atop the bank's brick facade. He briefly wondered if the sound was amplified by his own internal tension, a low thrum of anticipation he couldn't quite shake off. It was just a wire transfer, a routine transaction. A large sum, yes, but nothing out of the ordinary for someone in his position. Yet, a prickle of unease danced beneath his composed exterior, a feeling he attributed to the sheer banality of the task. Such mundane activities felt almost foreign in his world of high-stakes negotiations and million-dollar decisions. He took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of jasmine from a nearby bush momentarily distracting him. He registered the scent, a fleeting impression of delicate sweetness, before his mind refocused on the task at hand. The transfer was crucial. A delay could jeopardize a key acquisition, setting his company back weeks, perhaps even months. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders, a familiar burden he carried with an almost effortless grace. His outward demeanor remained unruffled. The muted hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed in Deshawn's ears, a counterpoint to the rhythmic click of the teller's keyboard. He took in the sterile environment of the Commonwealth Bank branch. The predictable beige walls, the worn carpet patterned with muted blues and greens, the faint scent of disinfectant battling the lingering aroma of stale coffee. The crisp edges of his documents felt strangely comforting against Deshawn's palm. He tucked them into his briefcase, the soft click of the latch a small, precise sound in the echoing quiet of the bank lobby. The weight of the briefcase, usually a symbol of achievement, now felt like a leaden reminder of the invisible wall he'd just encountered. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't shown a flicker of the frustration that simmered beneath his composed exterior. He knew the futility of outrage in this space, the ingrained deafness to his kind of voice. He straightened his tie, a subtle twitch in his jaw the only outward sign of the tight coil of anger in his gut. He wondered, not for the first time, if this constant vigilance, this careful calibration of his every move and word, was the price of his success, or was it simply the tax levied on his skin? He glanced back at the teller, Kyle, a young man with a nervous tremor in his smile, and saw not malice, but something more insidious, indifference laced with ingrained apprehension. The boy had averted his eyes, quickly retreating to the busy nothingness of counting bills, eager to erase Deshawn from his immediate reality. The cool air outside was a welcome balm against the stifling atmosphere of the bank. He stood for a moment on the steps, the sun glinting off the sleek black of his car parked at the curb. Greenwood, South Carolina, a town steeped in history, both beautiful and brutal, now felt like another small battleground in his personal war against the casual bigotry that permeated the very air he breathed. He took a deep breath, the scent of honeysuckle and freshly cut grass doing little to soothe the roiling emotions within. He reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over the contact listed as Justine Parrish, Midland Financial. He hesitated, a fleeting thought whispering of letting it go, of choosing his battles. But then the image of Pamela Knox's dismissive smile, the condescending tone of her voice, flashed through his mind. No, he couldn't let it go. Not this time. Not anymore. Inside the bank, Pamela Knox smoothed a non-existent wrinkle on her perfectly tailored skirt, her eyes following Deshawn's retreating figure. Just someone who got the wrong idea, she murmured, her voice laced with a dismissive sigh, designed for Cheryl's ears and perhaps for her own justification. Cheryl, perched on her stool behind the reception desk, nodded in eager agreement, her eyes flitting back to the computer screen where she resumed her meticulous filing of digital documents. The unspoken understanding between them, a silent pact forged in the crucible of shared prejudice, hung heavy in the air. "Looked like he was trying too hard," Cheryl chimed in, her voice a breathy whisper. A flicker of satisfaction crossed Pamela's face. Validation, even from Cheryl, was a balm to her bruised ego. Deshawn's calm demeanor, his impeccable suit, had unnerved her, challenged the carefully constructed hierarchy she presided over. His very presence had been a subtle indictment of her ingrained assumptions. "Fancy suit, shiny shoes," Pamela continued, a subtle sneer twisting her lips. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. She paused, letting the unspoken accusation linger. "Probably printed them off a fake website." Cheryl giggled, a nervous, high-pitched sound that grated on Pamela's nerves. She appreciated the affirmation, yet simultaneously felt a pang of annoyance at Cheryl's blatant sycophancy. It was a reflection, she knew, of her own power within this small, insular world. A power she wielded with casual cruelty, a power she now realized might have slipped a notch. The thought prickled, an uncomfortable itch beneath her carefully cultivated composure. She glanced at Kyle, who remained hunched over his counter, meticulously arranging stacks of bills, his movements almost robotic. He hadn't participated in their little exchange, yet his silence, his palpable discomfort, was a tacit acknowledgment of their shared understanding. He was young, still malleable, Pamela thought. He would learn. Deshawn's voice, calm and measured, cut through the quiet hum of the car's engine. "Justine, it's Deshawn Greer. I had an incident at your Greenwood branch. I'm calling to make a formal complaint." He paused, gathering his thoughts, carefully choosing his words. He knew the power of understatement, the impact of letting the facts speak for themselves. He recounted the events, his voice devoid of emotion, each word a precise, carefully placed stone in the edifice of his accusation. He felt a strange detachment, as if observing the scene from a distance, his own experience filtered through the lens of corporate protocol. He knew Justine. She was a woman of action, a force to be reckoned with. And he knew that this call, this seemingly small act of defiance, would have repercussions. As Deshawn relayed the details of his experience, Justine Parrish felt a familiar surge of anger, a cold fire that ignited in the pit of her stomach. She listened intently, her pen poised over her notepad, jotting down key phrases, her mind already racing ahead, strategizing. She recognized the subtle nuances in Deshawn's tone, the carefully controlled frustration, the quiet dignity that masked a deep well of anger. She knew what it meant to navigate the minefield of corporate America as a person of color, the constant vigilance, the subtle slights, the accumulated weight of 1,000 paper cuts. "I understand, Mr. Greer," she said, her voice calm but firm, "and I assure you, this will be investigated thoroughly. I'll be in touch within the hour." She hung up the phone, the quiet click echoing the finality of her decision. The wheels were already in motion. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn outside the bank. Inside, the air thrummed with a nervous energy, the unspoken tension palpable. Pamela Knox paced behind her desk, her carefully constructed composure beginning to fray. Cheryl, sensing the shift in atmosphere, fidgeted nervously, her eyes darting towards the door each time it opened. Kyle, pale and silent, continued his mechanical sorting of bills, his mind a whirlwind of anxiety. He'd never witnessed anything like this sudden shift in the usually predictable rhythm of the bank. The unspoken rules, the subtle hierarchies, the carefully maintained facade of normalcy, all seemed to be crumbling around him. He felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach, a premonition of the storm that was about to break. He didn't understand the complexities of it all, the deep-seated prejudices, the systemic inequalities. He only knew that he was caught in the crossfire, a silent witness to a battle he hadn't chosen. The fluorescent lights of the Commonwealth Bank hummed, a sterile counterpoint to the rising tension in the lobby. Pamela Knox, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack, felt a bead of sweat trace a path down her spine. She replayed her interaction with Deshawn Greer, searching for a justification, a plausible explanation for her actions. Had she truly been so blatant? Her internal monologue, usually a stream of self-assured pronouncements, now whispered anxieties she'd long suppressed. The man had been impeccably dressed, calm, polite. But those facts hadn't mattered. The image, the preconceived notion, had already taken root. She glanced at Cheryl, whose face, normally a mask of professional indifference, now reflected a dawning understanding of their precarious situation. Cheryl tugged nervously at the collar of her blouse, her eyes darting between Pamela and the imposing figure of Deshawn Greer, who stood silently by the window, a storm contained within the stillness of his posture. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic tap of his foot against the polished marble floor. It was a sound that seemed to echo the accelerating beat of Pamela's heart. What had she done? Then the glass doors swung open, admitting a woman whose presence instantly shifted the atmosphere. Tall and impeccably dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, she moved with an air of authority that silenced the hushed murmurs of the few remaining customers. Her heels clicked against the marble, a percussive announcement of her arrival. Pamela recognized her instantly. Justine Parrish, VP of Internal Operations at Midland Financial, Commonwealth's parent company. A chill colder than the air conditioning washed over Pamela. Her carefully constructed world, built on unspoken rules and ingrained biases, felt like it was beginning to crumble. Justine Parrish's gaze swept the lobby, assessing the scene with the precision of a surgeon. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, landed on Pamela, and a flicker of something akin to disappointment crossed her features. "My name is Justine Parrish," she announced, her voice carrying through the lobby without being raised. "I'm VP of Internal Operations at Midland Financial." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Pamela swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some kind of explanation, but Justine cut her off with a gesture. "I believe you've already met Mr. Greer." Justine's gaze shifted to Deshawn, a subtle acknowledgement of his presence. "He's the founder and CEO of Bleetch Technologies." Each word was enunciated with deliberate clarity, each syllable a hammer blow against Pamela's fragile composure. Bleetch Technologies. The name resonated in Pamela's mind, a stark reminder of the magnitude of her error. She had treated the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company like the thought remained unfinished, a knot of shame tightening in her chest. Deshawn turned from the window, his expression unreadable. He met Justine's gaze with a quiet dignity that amplified Pamela's humiliation. He hadn't needed to say a word. Justine's presence, her acknowledgement of his status, spoke volumes. "Ms. Knox," Justine continued, her voice hardening slightly, "you asked for proof of funds without verifying his identity first. Is that standard procedure at Commonwealth Bank?" The question hung in the air, a pointed accusation. Pamela felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. She stammered, I just wanted to be sure." It was a large transaction. Justine's eyebrow arched, a silent dismissal of Pamela's weak justification. "A large transaction?" she echoed, a hint of steel in her voice. "Mr. Greer's portfolio routinely handles transactions 10 times this size. You questioned his financial stability based on what, precisely? His appearance?" The unspoken word hung heavy in the air, a stark indictment of Pamela's prejudice. Cheryl, standing beside Pamela, shrank back as if physically struck. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She too was complicit. Pamela's internal monologue was a chaotic jumble of denial, fear, and regret. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that it wasn't what it seemed, but the words wouldn't come. The truth, stark and undeniable, was laid bare for everyone to see. She had judged Deshawn Greer based on the color of his skin, and she had been caught. Deshawn, still silent, observed the exchange with a detached intensity. He felt a flicker of satisfaction, a sense of justice being served. But it was a muted feeling tinged with weariness. This wasn't a victory, not really. It was a small crack in a vast edifice of prejudice. He knew that for every Pamela Knox exposed, there were countless others operating in the shadows, perpetuating the same subtle, insidious biases. Justine, sensing Deshawn's unspoken thoughts, turned to him. "Mr. Greer," she said, her voice softening slightly, "I sincerely apologize for the way you were treated. This is unacceptable, and we will take appropriate action." Her words were a promise, a commitment to accountability. Deshawn nodded, a flicker of something akin to hope crossing his features. He knew that one incident wouldn't change the world, but it was a start. He had spoken up, he had challenged the injustice, and he had been heard. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. He walked towards the counter, a renewed sense of purpose settling within him. He would complete his transaction, not as a victim, but as a man demanding the respect he deserved. The quiet resolve he had maintained throughout the ordeal solidified into a steely determination. This wasn't just about a wire transfer anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about demanding recognition, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been judged, dismissed, or marginalized because of the color of their skin. He straightened his shoulders, the weight of the moment settling upon him, not as a burden, but as a mantle of responsibility. The air in the Commonwealth Bank branch hung heavy, thick with the unspoken. Deshawn Greer stood his ground, a stillness in his posture that belied the tempest brewing within. He could feel the weight of every eye in the lobby, curious, judging, some perhaps even sympathetic. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to amplify the silence. He adjusted his tie, the subtle rustle of silk a stark contrast to the pounding in his chest. This isn't about the money anymore, he thought, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. This is about something much bigger. Pamela Knox, her face a mask of carefully constructed composure that didn't quite reach her eyes, stood opposite him, a rigid statue of misplaced authority. The scent of her perfume, something floral and cloying, hung in the air like a challenge. Deshawn inhaled deeply, the controlled breath a deliberate act of self-possession. He would not give her the satisfaction of seeing him unravel. "You don't know who people are," he began, his voice low and resonant, each word precise. He watched as a flicker of something annoyance, fear, crossed Pamela's face. "You think you do," he continued, his gaze sweeping over both Pamela and Cheryl, the receptionist whose silence had been as damning as any spoken word. "Based on clothes, voice, skin, but you don't." He paused, letting the unspoken accusation hang in the air like smoke. Pamela opened her mouth to speak, but Deshawn held up a hand, silencing her with a gesture. Inside, a sliver of satisfaction pierced through his frustration. He had taken back control of the narrative. "She underestimated me. They both did. You didn't need to be sure," he stated, his voice even, unwavering. "You needed to feel like you were in control." Pamela's carefully constructed composure finally cracked, a hairline fracture spreading across her features. Cheryl shifted uneasily, her gaze darting between Pamela and Deshawn like a trapped bird. The silence returned, heavier this time, charged with tension. Justine Parrish, her presence a quiet force in the unfolding drama, stepped forward. Her expression was unreadable, a professional mask that concealed the wheels turning within. Deshawn had a fleeting impression of steel beneath velvet. "Ms. Knox," Justine began, her voice crisp and clear, cutting through the stagnant air like a surgeon's scalpel. "We've had concerns about this branch for some time." Pamela's face paled, the blood draining from her lips. "Concerns? What concerns? This can't be happening," she thought, her mind reeling. Her carefully constructed world, her carefully cultivated image of efficiency and control, was crumbling around her. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat, a dry, choked sound. Justine continued, her voice calm but relentless, each word a hammer blow against Pamela's fragile defenses. Multiple complaints citing irregularities in customer service. She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Specifically, customers of color reporting difficulty in accessing standard banking services. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. The hushed whispers from the other customers in the lobby seemed to grow louder, a chorus of judgment. Cheryl's eyes widened, a dawning realization creeping into her face. Irregularities? Complaints? Oh God, she thought, her stomach twisting into a knot of fear. She hadn't meant to be part of this, hadn't meant to cause any harm. She'd just been following Pamela's lead, as always. But now, the consequences of her inaction, her complicity, were laid bare for all to see. Deshawn watched the scene unfold, a strange calm settling over him. He had expected anger, outrage, but all he felt was a profound weariness. This isn't an isolated incident, he realized. This is a pattern. He looked at Kyle, the young teller, his face pale and drawn. There was fear in his eyes, but also a flicker of something else. Shame, perhaps, or maybe recognition. Justine turned her attention to Pamela, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "You assumed," she stated, her voice laced with controlled steel. Carefully, without verifying, without checking his credentials, her words trailed off, the unspoken accusation hanging heavy in the air. Pamela's breath hitched in her throat. The room seemed to spin, the faces of the customers blurring into a kaleidoscope of judgment. Assumed? Yes, I assumed. The thought echoed in her mind, cold and stark. She had assumed, based on nothing but the color of his skin, the cut of his clothes, the timbre of his voice. She had assumed, and in doing so, she had exposed not only her own prejudice, but the systemic rot that festered beneath the surface of the institution she represented. The weight of her actions, the consequences of her choices, pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. The carefully constructed facade she had maintained for so long shattered, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. The world she knew, the world she controlled, was dissolving around her, and she was powerless to stop it. The fluorescent lights of the Commonwealth Bank hummed, casting a sterile glow on the scene unfolding below. Deshawn Greer stood by the now-empty teller window, his tall frame radiating a stillness that belied the turmoil within. He could feel the weight of eyes on him, whispers clinging to the periphery of his hearing. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted this public spectacle. All he had wanted was to complete a simple transaction. Yet, here he was, the unwilling protagonist in a drama of prejudice and ignorance. He adjusted his tie, a small, precise movement. Control. He needed to maintain control. This wasn't about him. It was about something larger, something that needed to be addressed. His eyes, dark and unwavering, met Justine Parrish's across the room. She held his gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the shared understanding that had passed between them. Justine's voice cut through the hushed atmosphere, crisp and professional, yet edged with a steel that Deshawn found oddly reassuring. "Pamela Knox, I'm suspending you from your duties, effective immediately." Pamela, her face a mask of stunned disbelief, opened her mouth to speak, but Justine raised a hand, silencing her. The hand, Deshawn noted, trembled ever so slightly. Was it anger, or the sheer effort of holding onto her composure in this charged environment? He could almost feel the pressure building within the branch manager, a volatile mix of humiliation and indignation. "I don't understand," Pamela finally stammered, her voice thin and reedy. Deshawn could almost smell the fear emanating from her, a cloying, metallic scent that mingled with the artificial freshness of the bank's air conditioning. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that this was more than just the loss of a job for Pamela. It was the shattering of her carefully constructed world, a world where she held power, where her biases were her shield. Justine's gaze didn't waver. "You have 5 more minutes to gather your personal belongings. After that, security will escort you from the premises." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Deshawn watched as Pamela's carefully applied makeup seemed to crack under the strain, revealing the raw vulnerability beneath. He felt a flicker of not sympathy, not quite, but a detached acknowledgement of the human cost of her actions. He knew that this incident, this public dismantling of her authority, would leave a scar. Cheryl, the receptionist, stood frozen behind her desk, her eyes wide and unblinking. She'd barely spoken throughout the ordeal, her silence a chilling echo of Pamela's prejudice. Deshawn wondered if she understood the gravity of the situation, if she grasped the complicity inherent in her inaction. Perhaps, he mused, she simply hadn't seen herself as part of the problem. That, he realized, was part of the problem itself. Justine turned her attention to Cheryl, her voice losing none of its steely edge. This branch is being placed under internal audit. All employee access will be suspended until further notice. That includes you, Cheryl. Cheryl flinched as if struck. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and fragile. She mumbled something unintelligible, her fingers nervously fidgeting with a stapler on her desk. The small, repetitive sound grated on Deshawn's nerves. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He needed to remain centered, to hold onto the quiet resolve that had carried him through this ordeal. Justine's voice resonated through the lobby, each word a hammer blow against the edifice of prejudice that had stood for so long. We're removing the people who don't represent what this company stands for. People who perpetuate harmful biases. People who fail to treat every customer with the respect they deserve. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the remaining bank employees, most of whom were studiously avoiding eye contact. Including you, she added, her voice softening slightly as she addressed Kyle, the young teller. You're being placed on probation. Consider this a learning opportunity, a chance to understand the impact of your actions, or in this case, your inaction. Kyle, who had been standing stiffly beside his station, swallowed hard. Deshawn saw the flicker of shame in his eyes, a flicker that hinted at the possibility of growth, of change. Perhaps, Deshawn thought, there was hope for him yet. Perhaps this incident, as unpleasant as it was, could serve as a catalyst for real transformation. Pamela, her belongings hastily gathered in a cardboard box, walked past Deshawn, her eyes downcast. He caught her sin again, that metallic tang of fear, now tinged with something else. Regret? Perhaps. But Deshawn didn't dwell on it. His focus was on the future, on the change that needed to happen. He had a voice, and he would use it. Justine approached him, her expression softening into something resembling gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Greer, she said quietly, for your patience, for your understanding, and for your courage. Deshawn met her gaze, his own expression unwavering. This isn't over, he said, his voice calm but firm. This is just the beginning. He knew this incident was only a small ripple in a vast ocean of systemic injustice. But he also knew that every ripple had the potential to become a wave. And he was ready to ride that wave, to lend his voice to the chorus calling for change, for accountability, for a future where respect and dignity were not conditional, not dependent on the color of one's skin. The humid South Carolina air hung heavy, thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and exhaust fumes. Deshawn stood on the sidewalk, the glass doors of Commonwealth Bank reflecting his image back at him, a stark silhouette against the cool, sterile interior. He watched the muted chaos unfold inside, the hurried whispers, the frantic gestures, the palpable sense of unease radiating outward like ripples in a disturbed pond. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a scene, yet his mere presence, his quiet insistence on being treated with the respect he deserved, had caused a seismic shift within those walls. He felt a strange detachment, as if observing the scene from a distance, the injustice he'd experienced just moments ago, both raw and surreal. He ran a hand over his face, the slight stubble of familiar comfort. The metallic tang of anger still lingered, a bitter aftertaste to the otherwise bland transaction he'd attempted to complete. Had he been any less composed, had he allowed the frustration to boil over into outward aggression, the narrative would have been twisted, contorted into another tired stereotype. He'd seen it before, experienced it firsthand, the presumption of guilt, the immediate defensiveness that painted him as the aggressor, the subtle but potent shift in power dynamics. He'd refused to play that role, refused to feed the beast of prejudice with his own justified anger. A figure emerged from the bank, her shoulders slumped, her face a mask of disbelief. Pamela Knox. He'd barely registered her features during the interaction, his focus solely on the task at hand. Now, seeing her in the harsh daylight, he noted the lines etched around her mouth, the tightness in her eyes. The mask of authority had crumbled, replaced by a raw vulnerability that didn't evoke sympathy, but rather a chilling understanding. He recognized the fear, the desperate scramble to salvage what remained of her carefully constructed world. It was the fear of consequence, not remorse. "Mr. Greer," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I just wanted to—" He held up a hand, silencing her. He didn't need her apologies, her hollow justifications. Her actions, her words, had spoken volumes. He saw the flicker of resentment in her eyes, the unspoken accusation that he was the cause of her downfall. He almost smiled. "You really just walked in here and destroyed my career in 1 hour," she finally managed, the words laced with a mixture of disbelief and accusation. "No," Deshawn replied, his voice calm, even. "You did that. I just gave you a mirror." He turned away, the image of her stricken face receding in his mind. He had no desire to witness her breakdown, to be drawn into her vortex of self-pity. His fight wasn't with her, not entirely. She was merely a symptom, a manifestation of a deeper, more insidious disease. A younger man, Kyle, the teller, hesitantly approached him. He fidgeted with his tie, his gaze darting nervously between Deshawn and the bank's entrance. He was the only one who'd shown even a flicker of unease, a hint of awareness that something was amiss. "Mr. Greer," Kyle stammered, I wanted to apologize. For everything." Deshawn met his gaze. He saw genuine remorse in the young man's eyes, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even shame. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying more weight than he intended. Kyle's apology, however small, held a sliver of hope, a suggestion that change was possible, however incremental. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, a notification from his bank. The wire transfer had been completed. A wave of exhaustion washed over him, the tension he'd held so tightly finally beginning to dissipate. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. He'd stood his ground, refused to be dismissed, refused to be silenced. He'd forced them to see him, not as a stereotype, but as a human being. He thought of Justine Parrish, the VP from Midland Financial, her sharp intelligence, her unwavering commitment to justice. Her swift action, her clear condemnation of the bank's behavior, had been a refreshing contrast to the subtle, insidious racism he'd encountered countless times before. He knew this single incident wouldn't dismantle the systemic bias embedded within institutions like Commonwealth Bank. He knew their fight, was far from over. But today he'd drawn a line in the sand. He'd shown them, and himself, that he wouldn't back down, wouldn't be erased. He'd made them see him. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk. He inhaled deeply, the lingering scent of exhaust now mingled with the sweet fragrance of honeysuckle from a nearby bush. He started walking, his steps measured, purposeful. He had a company to run, a future to build. He had a voice, and he would use it, not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever been made to feel invisible, for everyone who'd been denied the simple dignity of respect. The air in Bleetch Tech's temporary downtown office hummed with the quiet energy of focused work. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, reflecting off the sleek surfaces and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Deshawn sat at his makeshift desk, a stark white expanse in the otherwise industrial chic space, reviewing blueprints for the new server farm. The numbers swam before his eyes, not from any complexity, but from the lingering residue of the incident at the bank. It clung to him like a second skin, a constant reminder of the insidious nature of prejudice. He wasn't angry. Not anymore. The initial flare of frustration had long since cooled, replaced by a chilling sense of resignation and a steely resolve to see justice served. A shadow fell across the blueprints. Deshawn looked up, his gaze settling on a young man, fidgeting nervously in the doorway. He recognized him instantly, the teller, Kyle, the one who had stood frozen, a silent observer to the injustice unfolding before him. A knot tightened in Deshawn's stomach. He wasn't sure what to expect. An apology? A justification? Perhaps even a denial. Kyle shuffled closer, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. He clutched a worn messenger bag to his chest like a shield. "Mr. Greer," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Deshawn's initial reaction was to dismiss him, to tell him that his belated apology wouldn't erase the sting of that afternoon. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the genuine fear he saw in a young man's eyes, the way his shoulders slumped with a weight that seemed too heavy for his frame. Or perhaps it was a flicker of something else, a glimmer of genuine remorse. "Yes," Deshawn replied, his voice neutral, giving nothing away. "I'm Kyle," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I was the teller that day at the bank." His cheeks flushed crimson, a stark contrast to the pale skin stretched taut over his cheekbones. He swallowed hard, the action visible in the bob of his Adam's apple. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if wrestling with the words trapped in his throat. He ran a trembling hand through his hair. "I didn't know what was happening at first," he finally managed, the words barely audible. I saw, but I didn't understand." His eyes, a pale, watery blue, met Deshawn's, pleading for understanding. Deshawn watched him, his expression unreadable. He wondered what went through this young man's mind as he stood there, witnessing the casual cruelty of his superiors. Did he feel a pang of guilt, a flicker of empathy? Or was he simply paralyzed by fear, afraid to speak up, afraid to challenge the status quo? And then when I realized, Kyle's voice trailed off, his gaze dropping to the worn linoleum floor. "I should have said something. I know that now. I know silence is part of the problem." He looked up again, his eyes filled with a desperate earnestness. "I want to be better," he whispered, the words heavy with unspoken meaning. Deshawn leaned back in his chair, the slight creak of the metal a stark counterpoint to the silence that followed. He studied Kyle, searching for any hint of insincerity, any trace of performative remorse. But he found none. He saw only raw, unfiltered regret. He sighed, a long, slow exhale that seemed to carry the weight of years. "Most people aren't malicious," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. "They're just lazy." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Lazy with how they see the world. Lazy with how they think. Lazy with how they choose to act or not act. He looked directly at Kyle, his gaze unwavering. "You weren't cruel, Kyle," he continued, "but you didn't care enough to challenge what you saw either. You didn't care enough to see me as a person. You saw a stereotype, a preconceived notion, and you let that laziness dictate your actions, or rather, your inaction." The silence returned, heavier this time, charged with an unspoken understanding. The rhythmic hum of the office computers, the distant murmur of conversations, the faint whir of the air conditioning all seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two men, suspended in a shared moment of raw honesty. Kyle swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of Deshawn's words. "I understand," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I truly do." He fumbled with the strap of his messenger bag, the leather worn smooth from years of use. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Mr. Greer," he added, his voice gaining a newfound strength. I wanted you to know that I understand, and I'm going to do better." He looked up at Deshawn, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I promise you I will." Deshawn held his gaze, a slow smile spreading across his face. He saw in Kyle's eyes a genuine desire for change, a nascent understanding of the insidious nature of unconscious bias. It wasn't a victory, not entirely, but it was a start, a small crack in the wall of indifference, a glimmer of hope in the face of adversity. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the young man's sincerity. "Thank you, Kyle," he said, his voice filled with a quiet conviction. "That's all I ask." And in that shared moment of understanding, in that quiet exchange of words, a shift occurred. A subtle but significant turning point, a ripple of change in the vast ocean of ingrained prejudice. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in days, Deshawn felt a flicker of optimism, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the worn wooden floor of the community center, painting the room in a warm, hazy glow. Dust motes danced in the air, illuminated by the streams of light pouring through the tall windows. The air, thick with the lingering scent of stale coffee and disinfectant, hummed with a low, expectant buzz. Deshawn adjusted his tie, the silk cool against his skin, a stark contrast to the nervous heat building beneath his tailored suit. He hadn't expected to be here, a speaker at a town forum on small business access and community banking. 3 days. It had only been 3 days since the incident, yet it felt like a lifetime. He ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, a familiar gesture that betrayed his underlying tension. He could feel the weight of the room, the collective gaze of dozens of eyes. He inhaled deeply, the familiar scent of the center, a mix of old wood and community spirit, grounding him momentarily. "This isn't about me," he reminded himself. "It's about something bigger." The woman introducing him, a local council member, finished her effusive welcome, her voice echoing in the relative quiet. A smattering of applause rippled through the room, polite, expectant. Deshawn stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking softly against the wooden stage. He looked out at the faces before him, a mix of hopeful entrepreneurs, seasoned business owners, community elders, and curious onlookers. Each face a story, a universe of experiences he couldn't possibly fathom. He saw weariness, hope, apprehension, and a flicker of something else he couldn't quite place. Curiosity? Perhaps even skepticism. They want something real, he thought. Something they can connect with. He cleared his throat, the microphone amplifying the small sound. The silence deepened. 3 days ago, he began, his voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor of emotion he felt deep within. "I walked into a bank." He paused, letting the simple statement hang in the air. He could almost feel the invisible threads of attention tightening, drawing the audience closer. "I wanted to make a wire transfer, a significant one, for a land acquisition Bleetch Tech is pursuing. I had everything I needed. My identification, the necessary paperwork, the account details, everything meticulously prepared." His mind flashed back to the crisp documents in his hand, the weight of them a stark reminder of the stark contrast between preparedness and prejudice. But none of that mattered the moment they saw me. He let that sink in, the unspoken weight of the statement settling upon the room. Not because they knew who I was, but because they thought they did. He saw a few heads nod, a subtle acknowledgement of a shared experience. They saw a black man in a suit. He swallowed, the dryness in his throat a physical manifestation of the bitter memory. He could almost feel the ghost of Pamela Knox's condescending smile, the dismissive wave of her hand, the palpable air of suspicion that had clung to him like a shroud. He could hear Cheryl's whispered comment, the words laced with an insidious venom he still couldn't quite comprehend. Even young Kyle's nervous fidgeting, his averted gaze, had been a wound in its own way. In that moment, he continued, his voice gaining strength, fueled by the conviction of his purpose. All the hard work, all the accomplishments, all the years of striving for excellence were reduced to a single, limiting assumption. The words resonated within him, a deep echo of the injustice he'd experienced. They assumed they knew my story. They assumed they knew my intentions. They assumed I was a threat. He paused again, his gaze sweeping across the audience, holding their attention with the intensity of his gaze. The most dangerous thing we can do is assume. He saw understanding dawn in some eyes, a flicker of recognition in others. You don't know who people are. You don't know their struggles, their triumphs, their dreams. You don't know the weight they carry, the burdens they bear, or the hopes they hold close. He thought of Justine Parrish, her unwavering commitment to justice, her determination to dismantle the system that allowed such prejudice to flourish. Her actions have been a beacon of hope in the darkness, a testament to the power of allyship. Respect isn't earned by a resume. It's owed by default. His voice rang out, clear and strong, filling the room with the unwavering truth of his words. He watched as the audience absorbed his message, their expressions shifting from polite attention to genuine engagement. He could see the wheels turning, the internal conversations sparked by his words. This is what it's about, he thought. This is why I'm here. This isn't just about me, he continued, his voice softening slightly. It's about every person who has ever been judged, dismissed, or underestimated based on assumptions. It's about the countless missed opportunities, the stifled potential, the eroded trust that results from this pervasive bias. He saw a few heads nod in agreement, a silent affirmation of his words. We have to challenge these assumptions. We have to question our own biases. We have to create a community where everyone feels seen, heard, and respected, regardless of their background, their appearance, or their perceived status. He paused, letting his words reverberate through the room. This isn't just about banking, he concluded, his voice resonating with a newfound strength. It's about building a better future, a future where respect is the foundation, not the exception. He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. And that starts with each and every one of us. The silence that followed was different now, charged with a sense of shared purpose, a collective understanding. Then, the applause erupted, a wave of sound that washed over him, carrying with it the weight of hope and the promise of change. He had planted a seed, he hoped, a seed of change, a seed of understanding, a seed of respect. And in the fertile ground of that community center, he prayed it would take root and flourish.